Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I want to talk about the disparity between First World War war economies. And now, if you've listened to this podcast quite a bit, you'll know that in the past I've talked a lot about how the Second World War was largely won in terms of war production. It was won in the factories across America and across Britain and the British Empire, and of course in the tank plants of the Soviet Union. And the same, to a differing degree, can be said of the First World War, that Allied war production once again was one of the crucial factors in defeating the Kaiser's Germany. And of course, the intervention of the United States on the side of Great Britain and France was perhaps the most decisive factor in shaping the outcome of the war in terms of war production. The numbers of troops built up in Europe by 1918 are considerable, but the amount of fighting, of battles engaged in by the American Expeditionary Force was perhaps far lesser than the contribution made by American arms manufacturers. I'm reading today from David Stevenson's brilliant book, With Our Backs to the Wall, the history of the last year of the war, 1918. Obviously, with our backs to the wall is a quote from Haig during the Ludendorff offensive, essentially saying that it was that how the Allied soldiers had to fight in order for the Allied war effort to survive at all. And David Stevenson points out when discussing America and American war production that by 1913, a year before the war began, the GDP of the USA was more than double that of Russia or Germany. Pre-war steel production was greater than France, Germany, and Britain combined. And this had been part of this kind of phenomena had developed over the previous half century since the end of the Civil War. And the northeast of America would now be the kind of the Brexit states, the American Rust Belt, had been a century ago the epicenter of not just American but really world industry. The railway, iron, steel, chemicals, and engineering plants in the northeast of America were the largest in America. But also it was the biggest aggregation of industry probably at that point ever created. Bismarck is once quoted to have said, though obviously Bismarck is quoted to have been quoted to have said so many things, that the supremely important, and I paraphrase here, the supremely important geopolitical fact of our time is that Americans speak English. And that really meant, in his eyes, that the power that America could exert in the world would have to be, as far as Germany and other non-English speaking nations were concerned, treated very carefully, because the British, in Bismarck's eyes, prophetically, might one day be able to call on their Atlantic relative to draw them into a conflict for shared Anglo-Saxon values. Was a kind of very kind of Germanocentric way of looking at things. It's worth pointing out here that from the mid years of the First World War onwards, it was speculated on the revolutionary left, but also in kind of quite conservative right-wing circles, that possibly America and Britain might be the two powers next to come to blows, as America sought to eclipse Britain's place that it had held throughout the 19th century as the world's supreme economic power. Living standards in the US were higher, productivity was higher than any other fighting state in the First World War, but in the First World War, the Americans didn't dominate Allied war production in quite the same way as they did in the Second World War. When the American Expeditionary Force entered the field, initially their weapons came largely from French factories, and the steel that went into making those often came from America, and the fuel that went into those French factories often came from America too. Also, the fuel to power tanks and other equipment. So America has this curious relationship with war production that definitely solidifies and refines itself in the Second World War. And this meant that in the First World War, the relationship between America and her associate powers across the other side of the Atlantic was perhaps more even, certainly after 1940, with an occupied France and a Britain facing financial and perhaps even military defeat. America has a far more uneven relationship. By 1918, America represented to the Central Powers the future, and a foreboding future it was. In America, they saw the power that, once fully mobilised, would be able to defeat anybody. By 1941, a fully mobilised America represented this on a far grander scale and was able to fight two wars, one in the Pacific, one in Europe, and was able to fight an air war on a grand scale. So the position that America holds in the First World War is demonstrably different, and yet there are kind of similarities of trends emerging in the development of America's world power. America was the lending house to Great Britain, Wall Street banks, and then banks supported by the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve became the financiers of the British war effort. But nobody was lending to America. America became a country with a vast economic surplus as a result of the war, and also a financial surplus. But the money, in order to lend, had to come from somewhere, and the money that was originally lent from private banks, which is then later underwritten by the US government, has eventually to come from American taxpayers. And the cost of the war was underwritten. The Treasury Secretary, William Gibbs Mikado, described it as a stupendous burden, and each day America spent some $42.8 million. The British each day spent $32.6 million, France $32.4 million, Germany 32.2, and Italy 10.4 million. Expenditure in 1917 to 18 was less than 1/6 that was spent in 1941 to 45. It was still roughly comparable in terms of percentage of GDP to that which was spent in Vietnam between 1964 and 1973. And as a proportion of GNP, significantly higher. The First World War, therefore, was the most expensive war in US history after the Second World War and the 2003 Iraq War. Now, to give you a scale of the increase in costs borne by America, the federal government's rate of spending in the year 1917 to 18 was just under 14 times higher than it had been in the year 1916 to 17. And this was a bigger increase from peacetime to war than was seen later on in the Second World War. The inflation rate in America, because of the kind of the productive capacity of the economy, was lower than any other fighting power. And as we can see in Britain, in Italy, in France, and in Germany, inflation comes to play between the mid-years of the First World War and into the mid-1920s, a serious disrupting factor in economy and politics. America experiences some of this, but by no means all. The government proposed funding, the US government says, proposed funding to create an army of 1 million soldiers and $3 billion in loans to Britain and France and other wartime allies. And this was to be raised through taxation. The 1917 War Revenue Act shifted the federal budget away from indirect taxes, and such as taxes on consumption and customs and excise duties, towards direct taxes on incomes. So this was supposedly a more progressive kind of taxation. Taxation on consumption, by and large, affects poorer people more. Federal revenue increased 3 times in 1918 as a result of the Act. However, until there was money in the bank, until the money had actually been collected, the federal government used 60-day certificates or bonds. These act essentially as a federal IOU. There was almost no possibility of the federal government itself going bust or ceasing to exist, and therefore it is a safe bet to purchase one. It is always going to pay out, as is the case with sovereign government debt of governments which are broadly seen to be able to last the tests of time. The Germans and the British had both financed their wars in this fashion, and so America was modelling itself on a pre-existing practice. The American government hoped that they could manage to get a great deal of interest from the American people in purchasing bonds, yet offer interest rates which were below that which the market could offer. And they hoped that patriotism would be the way in which people would convince themselves to buy these less than competitive investments. The bonds were called Liberty bonds, and they created the finance to offer Liberty loans. And Mikado suggested that these were, and I quote, issued in the name of freedom for the purpose of waging war against autocracy. He said in his memoirs, "We capitalized the profound impulse called patriotism." It's in these ways I've always believed that American notions of freedom and liberty, particularly these are particularly 20th century notions of freedom and liberty, emerged. The idea that America had a special, perhaps divinely appointed role in the world to defend the notion of freedom and to challenge autocracies or tyrannies or undemocratic societies, and to offer a blanket of freedom and liberty, an umbrella of freedom and liberty to others. These are notions that last from the First World War all the way to the end of the Cold War. It might be argued that they are considerably in decline now, but one of the ways in which these embed in the everyday lives and practices of people, and they become more than simply just esoteric notions, are through the purchasing of bonds or any other action, such as war munitions work, that embeds an individual in the processes of the state, and it politicizes those in a particular way. It gives them a particular ideological justification. If you buy this bond, you are helping to spread the American idea of liberty throughout the world, which is a lot easier than explaining the political realities of the war. Liberty bonds were issued on the 15th of June 1917, and they had an interest rate of 3.5%, which again was below the standard market rates. However, there was tax exemption on the income, and the bond would mature in 30 years, though it was cashable after 15. $2 billion of stock were offered, but eventually 3.03 billion were finally taken up by the end of the war. And this meant that the calculations that Mikado made were more than apposite. The low interest rate that was offered was no impediment to demand. There was an oversubscription rate of 52%. This meant that the targets for financing the American war effort that had been set by Mikado through bonds had been breached, had been exceeded significantly. So his gamble on the saleability of patriotism worked very well. Another 9 billion in bonds were issued by October 1918, all of which were oversubscribed, and the total of $14 billion was raised in that time period, which was half the American government's war expenditure. So bonds were vitally important ways of raising funds. And this tells us something very interesting. Now, in previous podcasts, I've talked about the complexities of the repayment of war debt and how the inability to find a settlement for German reparations, Anglo-American repayment of war debt, and the repudiation of war debt by the Soviet Union after 1918. Meant that it became very difficult to create a kind of an established, a sort of stable world order. Well, one of the reasons why the American government was so keen on getting its war debt back as quickly as possible was that it had a direct electoral bearing on American politics. Ordinary bondholders were keen to know that their investments were being repaid. Didn't make a great deal of difference one way or another. The bond was a guarantee from the government to be paid out, but it made very bad headlines when there was the possibility of the French or the British or anybody else dragging their feet. So the focus in negotiations at the Paris Peace Conference and later on at the Washington Conference was that debts be repaid as quickly as possible. Volunteers across America sold bonds to the public. The second loan had 60,000 saleswomen alone, encouraging investors to put their savings into war bonds. So it was a mass national effort to raise this finance. However, a large chunk of the investment came from wealthy individuals and from business. Now, if you have a lot of money and you want to protect it, you don't necessarily want to put it into harebrained schemes that will, or volatile stock market conditions that will make you a fortune quickly, and you don't need to because you've already got one. Bonds are a good thing to buy. These are a guarantee from the government that you will be repaid, and repaid more than you originally invested. The percentages aren't huge, but then again, if you're putting in a large sum of money to begin with, what you're chiefly interested in is protecting it. So the bond did represent a good, safe investment in a very chaotic and uncertain world. It was also a great way to avoid tax, which is something that people were as keen to do 100 years ago as they are now, it would appear. Raising huge amounts of cheap money meant that the American government could lend to the British and the French at far cheaper rates than they could have got from anywhere else. And this was a comparative advantage over Germany. Germany and the other Central Powers had far less access to credit and finance, and they were unable to borrow on such favourable terms. And it seems strange that wars are won on things such as interest rates, but in this case, to some extent, it was. The Allies combined received $7.1 billion in US Treasury credits. The British and the French were able to borrow in terms in some ways which were more favourable than during the period of Lend-Lease in the Second World War. They were, for example, able to borrow without any collateral. They didn't have to offer any overseas territories or bases or anything else by way of surety on the loan. The only way that Wilson was willing to even consider financing the Allies was if it was on the condition of it being a loan and not a gift of money, and Congress certainly wouldn't have considered for a moment gifting anything to the British or French. To give you an indication of how little the British had left was that in April 1917, the month that the US joins the war, the British government the Treasury has $219 million in gold and securities left. And this was basically 3 weeks' worth. Expenditure of $75 million a week was what the war required. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Andrew Bonar Law, said that he could only go on financing the country for that period of time, for basically for 3 weeks. Arthur Balfour, Foreign Secretary, went to Washington in May 1917, and he basically explains that to the American government that running out of money was a far bigger threat to the British than anything the Germans could throw at them. The fear of running out of money was far more deadly even than U-boats. Running out of money meant that the war effort would essentially end. All of this is quite a surprise to Mikado, the American who was most chiefly engaged with Allied discussions of finances. He had no idea that the British, particularly, and also by extension the French, were in such dire straits, and suddenly realised that America would wind up having to lend to its associate powers and allies far more money than had previously been considered. And in sort of an interesting kind of parallels with Roosevelt's short of war strategy, Mikado said to Congress that the loans would not only benefit American manufacturers and American farmers, because it was American produce that was very often being purchased, but it would be better to offer loans than to send troops. And he said that there would be a substitute for soldiers that would save the lives of the young men of America. Though that said, there was clearly going to be a point at which an American expeditionary force would travel to Europe. The irony for America is that as all this hot finance flows back into the USA, American productive capital, factories and mines and steel works and all these things are overwhelmed by the massive upsurge in orders, and this leads to the beginnings of inflation in America. I did a podcast a couple of years ago now on the subject of inflation in the early 1920s and how it had become a global phenomena, and war seems to have been this kind of globalizing inflationary force, touching all sorts and interconnecting all sorts of disparate economies and driving inflation between them. Anyway, I'm going to finish there, but this is definitely something I'm coming back to in the coming weeks, to look at war production and finance for all Allied powers throughout the war, but we'll definitely continue with America for a while to come. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope you find this useful. Come down to our Explaining History Facebook group. They've got lots and lots of cool stuff happening there at the moment, new content, new everything, some cool conversations about history and good books to read, and I'll catch you there hopefully. Take care, bye bye, and thanks for listening.